So around summer last year, I completed the definitive edition of Mafia, the first entry of course in the Mafia Trilogy. Now the original released way back in 2002, and 18 years later, in 2020, they decided to remake the game from the ground up. That means modern day graphics, an expanded and tweaked story, and a world redesign. I ended up enjoying the game way more than I expected, and Mafia has now become one of my favourite story games. Now the definitive version felt like a whole new game, and they blew it out the park. It really was a definitive remake. Obviously there's 2 more games coming off from Mafia, that being Mafia 2 and 3, both having their new upgrade. The thing that I only just found out before starting Mafia 2, the definitive version, was that this time it isn't a remake and only a remaster with updated visuals. If you already own the original, then the upgrade was given to you free. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a bit of a disappointment by this, as coming off of Mafia I was ready to see what they would do with the second entry. Nevertheless, I still went in with an open eye, as the old games were still great when they first released, so I was still excited. Now let's start off with the gameplay of Mafia 2. In terms of the open world which the game is, between each missions you can freely explore the fictional setting of Empire Bay, which does mix the areas of the inspiration of New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Detroit and other areas. Compared to Mafia, it seemed like they focus on the world being a bit more fleshed out, with better location variety for the most part and more things to do, which I'll get into, though the overall world isn't giant, and it's not like everywhere you go there's going to be something interesting, because they haven't remade the world. It's still the base design from 2010. Again, I would say it's more involved than Mafia and gives off a really good representation of what it would be like, but with Mafia Definitive Edition and how gorgeous those textures and lighting is in that game, they both have their own aspects better than others. As you progress through the game, your main house location also changes and moves location. These go by safe houses, which is where you can go back to change clothes, which you can also purchase now, and that wasn't in the original, I believe. You can also store multiple vehicles there and find food and drink, which helps to gain health. Now the weapon variation is actually quite good in this game, and for a game that's not a remake, I was quite surprised with how much selection there actually is to test out. They all follow the same Mafia theme and ones of that era, around the 1940s to 50s, this being many handguns, rifles, SMGs like the classic Tommy gun, and shotguns, but there's of course many throwables as well, like grenades and molotovs. The weapons do have a bit of weight to them, and of course they vary with each one. Whilst in gun combat, you also have the ability to cover behind objects and walls, helping a lot. It would have been nice to have it be a bit more fluid in terms of exiting and going into cover, even just smoother animations. And the game does emphasize a tactical playstyle rather than just spraying and praying, for the most part anyway, and this seems to be common in the series. Now the melee combat is quite fun and quite easy to do, though it's quite simple, the typical light and heavy strikes, blocking and countering attacks, etc. But visually it does look good, and the finishes are fun to watch. While it's nothing crazy, it's smooth to play. The same with stealth, which I did a fair share of in the game. However, again, it really is just one stealth kill move and animation, which is sort of what I expected, as it's still following that 2010 gameplay. I don't want to be too harsh because I'm not judging it on how well they remastered the game, that's not what this review is, but just as an overall. At the end of the day, it was still fine to implement with other sides of combat. Now focusing on the world a bit more, the AI isn't that bad in this game, more so the police system, which is quite advanced, like when they try to arrest you or find you, for example. This may even be when you hit into another vehicle, pull out a weapon or go over the speed limit and they spot you. Now there is some freedom when this does happen to you, like you being able to pay the fine, or with arrest you can bribe them, but there's also the fun method of resisting them, which of course does result in guns blazing and you'll have to escape them, though they don't have much hesitation in shooting, and it's a slight challenge to get away or fend them off, which is always quite engaging. Now let's say you do lose them, if they spotted your car before, then it will become wanted, so they can easily spot you again unless you switch your car or the number plate. They also take note of you, meaning you'll have to change Vito's clothes in the safe house. That's if you have multiple. As I mentioned, you can buy some more, which is pretty good customization. It would have been nice to see a bit more, of course it's only a remaster and there's only set outfits, rather than, you know, mixing and matching the clothes. Lastly, when you're in mid-combat with enemies, the police will still come after you, but they also take down other enemies, which helps you in a way. Overall, the whole cop system is a lot more realistic than I thought it would be, and a very big aspect of the gameplay. That's why I really looked into it, and it does add to that immersion of the world. Not just the police, but population density is quite vast, with tons of people walking down the sides of roads in the street, you know, sat on benches and doing small jobs, etc. Even the outfits, where most of them are different to each other and follow that fashion style of that time period. As I mentioned, you can access an array of shops, clothing, food, weapons, and even car washes. So the world is more involved, yet there's still lots of empty space and repetitive areas. This does make it quite fun to drive around, because it really is just endless streets and roads, which brings me on to the driving mechanics, which I would say is quite a loved and hated aspect of the game. Some people really enjoy the realistic weight and turning of the vehicles, which demonstrates what they would feel like because of them being such old models, but others just want quicker and free movement rather than just realism when driving, which I can understand. Personally, I quite liked it, and as I said, they presented it well. Funny enough, with the turning being less snappy and fast, it's actually quite smooth and way easier to drive, but the biggest aspect being that it's really realistic. But as I stated, I can see how some people might find it repetitive, this being mixed in with the world design as well. Now I'd like to move away from open world and more so the mission design. Now with the story being by far the best part of this game, and I'll talk about that later, the missions are also tied in really well, enhancing the experience, but in terms of what you do in them, most of it being combat and cover shooting, with the base gameplay coming from a 13-year-old game, it isn't going to be the most thrilling piece of gaming. This is another reason why it would have been great to remake the game from the ground up, like Mafia did. And a lot of people agree that the original had better gameplay in 2, so imagine upgrading that and that, but I could also go on for hours and, reasons with why they could have. Either way, the missions design follow a very similar formula that start to have a samey feel to them as you progress further into it, which is when they should really start to change and stand out a bit more. It does still come with some good ones though. Let's move on to visuals, where with this being only a remaster, that is the biggest aspect that everyone notices when checking out a remastered game, as it's more so focusing on how the game looks rather than how it plays out or what's added. But a lot of people, including myself, were kind of surprised when the comparison and graphics and visuals, they were extremely similar and underwhelming. Yes, it does look slightly better with sharper textures and lighting, but for a remaster it does look near enough the same to some games that came out a few years after the original Mafia 2. Not just the character faces looking the same in game, but also the cutscenes having very little difference. Though it's nowhere near as bad as how it was when the version first released, the performance wasn't perfect, which is yet another big aspect when remastering a game. I'm not sure how bad the frame rate and bugs were in the original, but the complaints at launch where people physically couldn't play the game and would genuinely prefer the original and its smoother gameplay. The bugs were pretty bad and common, but luckily reviewing this game in 2023, it's one of the things that has changed and what may bring people back who didn't play it from those complaints. I noticed the odd frame drop and texture pop in, but nothing game breaking, and that's usually when I was driving fast, which I was okay with, and overall it runs quite well now, which is a bonus. Lastly, I'd like to talk about by far the best part of the game and what makes it, and that's the story of Mafia 2. Now if you didn't know, this is a sequel to Mafia, the first entry. As mentioned, it's set in 1945 to 1951 compared to the 1930 to 38 setting of Mafia. The main protagonist goes by Vito Scaletta, where you follow his character development through the Mafia, and it really is engaging to watch unfold. I think the best part of the writing is the pacing. There's nothing worse than a story's pacing being off, and Mafia 2 doesn't do that. It's almost perfect. They don't rush the game so it becomes overwhelming or less engaging, but they also don't bore you or make it go so slow. It flows well when you clearly see the character development by having it this way without making it drag. I think it's one of the most important aspects in a game's story, and you never want to stop playing through because you become disengaged at any point. This game actually pushes you to carry on through, and that's great, and it's exactly the same with the previous entry, which I love. Mafia does storytelling so well, and it's the aspect that fully upgrades, or you could even say it saves the games. The game also provides some well thought out and good context for Vito's character and how he grows into the man he is at the end of the game, from when he first moved to America at a young age and how he coped in his early life. Again, another great aspect in the first entry as well. So overall, the story is you following through the life of Vito in almost every aspect and how he got into the crime life. The game presents it incredibly well, and this side of the game alone is enough to go check it out, and that's where I end this review. I definitely recommend Mafia 2 in 2023, and even Mafia as well. For the record, they aren't connected in major ways. There's a few references, but for the most part it is a totally different storyline. And I did do a Mafia review quite a while back, but it's really old and I think I'll do an updated version. Mafia 2 Definitive Edition, while the remaster wasn't amazing and the base gameplay could be seen as not the most riveting, there's small aspects of it that I really liked, but even if you don't like any part of it at all for whatever reason, the story is more than enough of a reason to play Mafia 2. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, then let me know by tapping that like button down below, and if you enjoy story video games, then that's what this channel is all about. There's a playlist of a series I've done in the description down below, and you can subscribe to the channel if you'd like to. Lastly, if you'd like to support me me by becoming a member of the channel and gain access to various perks, then there'll be a join button below or a link in the description. Thank you for the support and watching until the very end, I really appreciate it. That was Mafia 2, the definitive edition, and bye bye.